Well, I'm sitting here with Giancarlo Vulcano, who is the composer of Unfinished Spaces and works on 30 Rock. And, well, thank you so much for doing this, Giancarlo.
Thank you very much.
So, I guess to get started, how did you get into music and what made you want to compose for the visual mediums?
I got into music a little before high school, just playing guitar in bands and stuff like that. And then I got into sort of jazz. By the time I was in college, I was really focused on jazz. And by the time I got out of college, I focused on composing, like classical music, new music.
Hmm.
And when I got out of college, I got a master's, also in composition. But I met Lenny Pickett, who's the music director for Saturday Night Live, and he asked me if I knew how to do music copying, and I told him yes. And anyway, I got involved with Saturday Night Live, and through that, I got involved with Howard Shore because Howard has a long association with SNL because he was the first music director. Anyway, he was getting very busy on Lord of the Rings, and so I got a job with Howard, and I honestly was more in the mind space of being a classical composer until and then I got a job with Howard, and over the last 10 years, I've come to like really love the art of scoring films. Like I no longer, if I ever had any sort of like snobbish thing about being a classical composer, I think that's kind of gone out the window now because now I really love working in film. Like I don't think it's like sort of another thing I do. No, no, no. I like working in film.
Hmm.
So that's the story.
And, I mean, I guess you being classical composer, did you have any influences growing up, whether it be from composing or film composing or any other composers?
Well, uh, I mean, my main composing influences. I mean, they weren't from when I was a kid, but once I got into music, I still am really into Stravinsky,
Hmm.
Morton Feldman, uh, Messiaen. Those are kind of my big three as composers, and but Stravinsky going back to college. I remember I was a freshman, so that means you're 18 years old, and I went to hear Pierre Boulez conduct The Rite of Spring. I mean, Stravinsky's been a big deal in my life for a really long time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, and now with Unfinished Spaces, which is a documentary, you were tasked with a very challenging job. I think I mean any documentary is challenging for a composer, but this one that is balancing intellect and emotion, that must have been hard to find that line for the music to be.
It was really hard. Another really hard thing was, whenever you do a film about a place like Cuba, for example, or it could be China or whatever, the like the path of least resistance is always to sort of get into sort of like the like the sounds of that place. In other words, if for Cuba, the temptation was really to lean on like a very Cuban salsa score,
Hmm.
and I definitely like. First of all, I'm not the person to do that because I'm not really a Cuban expert musically. And secondly, I didn't want it to be about that. I didn't want the great artists to sort of be pigeonholed uh, as like Cuban. And so I stayed away from as much of like the salsa as we possibly could. And so yeah, in terms of the intellectual stuff, I was trying to connect the architecture with every other modernist strain, like modernist music. So I compose a lot more. Again, might be a little bit Stravinsky and sort of very clean gestures. I was just really trying to connect with what I was seeing with the buildings,
Hmm.
and then there were a few emotional cues, because the guys themselves, the architects, are just such sympathetic characters. But that stuff always writes itself, Whenever there's like something uh, emotionally powerful that you're watching, I mean, the music writes itself when the stuff on the screen is powerful.
Hmm.
So the challenge. You're right. It was the intellectual stuff and how to make that read into sort of match the visuals of the buildings and stuff. Yeah.
And working with a documentary, there's a lot of dialogue and interviews. So how hard is it for composers for the music not to trip up with the words?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, yeah, there's so much music in Unfinished Spaces.
Hmm.
It's just incredible. Yeah, how do you not trip up? I don't know. You just sort of you don't write the busiest stuff in the world, and you sort of hope the mixer's good. And in this case, he was excellent. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you just sort of like the dialogue and the music kind of tag team. And when the
Hmm.
dialogue is saying something very important, music is kind of pedaling. And then when they're doing things that are, I don't know, a little less interest. I don't know. You just pick your moments.
Right, right.
To sort of come out.
Just to find places for the music to breathe.
Totally,
Hmm.
totally.
And in your opinion, what's the biggest difference between composing a nonfiction documentary versus a fictional narrative?
That's a good question. I feel like actually, I feel like documentaries. There's sort of like like a language of documentary music
Hmm.
in a weird way. It's sort of like if you watch a lot of documentaries, the music is kind of similar a lot of the time. I think it's because of the thing you're saying with the dialogue,
Right.
where it's like you got to pedal a lot more than you might in a drama or something. So uh, the hard part in documentary is writing good music. Basically, it's like I think that people just want they're used to hearing a certain kind of music in a documentary, and that's not exactly what I was interested in writing. Do you
Hmm.
know what I mean? So that was the hard part. Yeah, I guess in other words, when you're doing another kind of film, for example, like a narrative film, uh, you can really invent the world of it, and you can choose an orchestration that's sort of interesting in the context of the film. And I felt like in the documentary thing, it's sort of like I don't know. To me, it just feels like there's sort of like like an established language of documentary film,
Hmm.
and for me, that was a challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's definitely a different structure to documentary scoring, at least I think.
Yeah.
So, and now changing, completely on the other side of the spectrum, you work on 30 Rock with composer Jeff Richmond,
Yeah.
and I've always been interested to talk to someone who works on a 30-minute sitcom. So, I mean, how does score function on that kind of platform?
Uh, yeah, 30 Rock is a show. I met him again through the SNL thing,
Hmm.
uh, and we write music for every show, which is quite different than a lot of sitcoms
All right.
where they sort of have a library of cues and they just kind of do it. And we also score a lot more of the action than you generally get in a comedy, a half-hour comedy. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's a lot of work because we score each episode. And the way it works, Jeff is really he's like an executive producer on the show. He directs a lot of the shows. He's really, really involved in the editing of the show and the tone of each episode. So he's really got his fingers all over the place.
Hmm.
So basically, the way it works is that we wait until the show is locked and score it. And he's the composer. I'm kind of the second guy,
Right.
but he'll come up with themes for it, and we'll just kind of flesh that stuff out. And generally, a few days before we mix the show, we record it. Like I play all the guitar and all like the banjo that you hear. He plays all the saxophone, piano that you hear. So it's sort of like it's like a film except very truncated, and you do it 23 times in 8 months.
Yeah. But I mean, comedy. I think comedy scoring, at least from. I mean, I'm not a musician, but I would think it would be the hardest type of music to write. Would you agree
Yeah,
with that?
I think so. I'm so happy that I've had this opportunity. I've been with that show since season one,
Hmm.
and it's just so incredibly educational to work on a comedy. And Jeff is so great at writing comedy music. It's been a real education. So obviously it's complicated because you can't get no step on any jokes or sort of step on any lines. you're really dealing with a structure that's sort of a little more delicate than, I don't know, like a drama, I would think, like,
Right.
or a fight scene or something. It's kind of like, it's a little more delicate. But on the other hand, comedy, I just realized this, has this thing where if the music makes you laugh, then you know you did the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
So all you have to do basically is wait until you're laughing at the music. Do you know what I mean? You just write music, and if it doesn't make you laugh, then it's not right.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, that's easier than, for example, a psychological drama where you can score it so many different ways and this and that. In comedy, it's like if it makes you laugh, then it's kind of a success. So in a way, it's easier too, but it's certainly complicated to score comedy.
Right. And so, what kind of time frame do you have working with the series? Is it? I mean, are you working week to week to week as the episodes are churned out?
Yeah, yeah. We basically go from like October to April or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and they film. Each episode takes about a week to film, and then it takes probably another couple of weeks in the editing stage, where they're editing. Each episode goes through a certain amount of cuts. Like they make a cut, then they give notes, and they do another cut, and so there's a few cuts, and then it gets locked, and then, I mean, sometimes the show locks, and there's like literally 4 days to do everything.
Wow.
But you can do a lot of work before the show is actually locked, knowing that, well, you'll probably have to adjust things for the locked picture. But it also, 30 Rock has a lot of like pre-written musical stuff where characters sing, or there's a lot of musical numbers on the show. So that actually kind of helps because you can really get ahead on that stuff. Because that might be 2 or 3 minutes of the episode that you've got done really early on. So, but that's basically the picture. I mean, the turnaround's outrageous. Sometimes it's 4 days, 3 days. It's just amazing.
So compared to season 1 to now, how is your workflow? Is it so much easier now? Like compared to the season 1, like really hectic for those first couple episodes?
Well, I mean, now it's like we have 3,000 pieces of music in the library, so we can really draw on stuff. So sometimes, each episode has a theme, I would say, and Jeff writes sort of like a theme that gets used for the main storyline of that episode. But there's little act opens or act closes. We don't write all of those, so a lot of that stuff is sort of from the library.
Right.
The first episodes, I think, were probably harder because you're always trying to figure out what the hell the music is going to be like.
Yeah.
Like how much is there going to be? How you're going to use it? Do you know what I mean? So we're kind of in a sweet spot right now, just because the role of the music is really clear, and also there's a big library of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you also you mentioned earlier that you worked with Howard Shore earlier in your career. Looking back on that, what's the most important thing you learned from working with him?
Man, I learned a lot from Howard too. I mean, I was so lucky because I worked on all the Lord of the Rings,
Mm-hmm.
And I worked on like 3 Scorsese movies and a David Cronenberg movie. I mean, it was an amazing experience. Each composer does it his or her own way.
Right.
So you just learn Howard's method and his sort of. I mean, his workflow is pretty intense too. I don't know. It's you just learn so much in addition to like all the sort of musical things. The tricks he's got up his sleeve. I'm sure every composer has different tricks up his sleeve, but Howard certainly has a lot of them. And then you see Howard sort of address a director's notes. For example, in a recording session, the director might say this or that, and just to see how Howard like addresses that's a fascinating thing, because I think it's like when you're composing and someone says they don't like the music, your impulse is always to sort of throw the whole piece out and start from scratch. But a lot of times it's like they don't really not like the whole piece, and there's certain adjustments that can be made whereby they become very happy with the piece. And so, I mean, Howard is a master of sort of listening to the director and sort of understanding on a very like non-verbal level what the guy wants. So that was very interesting. And I mean, he wrote such great music. I don't know. You just the Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's such an amazing score. Just to be around that for 3 years, that was pretty
Yeah,
great.
that
Yeah,
must have been amazing. So,
yeah.
um, well, I guess starting to wrap up. Is there anything that you're working on that you can talk about, or is
I'm
everything?
doing another documentary, which is great. It's called The Longest Game. It's a feature-length doc by Camille Thoman, who's a director who I scored a short by her
Hmm.
as well, and it's a much more personal documentary than Unfinished Spaces. And it's sort of very emotional film. I mean, I think Unfinished Spaces was too, but this is a really personal and emotional documentary. It's really being told in an interesting way. Uh, I think it's going to be very special when it's finished. So I'm working on that, and it looks like I'm going to do a feature length comedy, which I'm sure I'm not supposed to talk about, but so I'm getting to do a comedy hopefully, which is great.
Oh, well, looking forward to that being announced. Now, I always like to finish off. I like to ask every composer this question: if you had the opportunity to score any film ever made with no disrespect to the original composer, what movie would you choose?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably do Twin Peaks, all
Oh,
3 seasons. Yeah.
wow. All right. That's a
I
see.
mean, I say I'd probably just do exactly what Angela did. 'Cause I feel like that's some of the greatest music of all time for a picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
So that or Chinatown, Jerry Goldsmith.
well, there you go.
Just those two.
Well, Giancarlo, thank you so much. I'm out of questions for you, but I really hope we can do this again sometime. It's been a real pleasure.
Pleasure for me too. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, bye.